All right, if we continue on with our discussion of marginal benefit and marginal cost and the whole idea of what's socially optimal, let's talk a little bit more about marginal benefit, okay? Marginal benefit helps us understand something called consumer surplus. Now, let's talk about this because this potentially can be confusing. Earlier in a video, we talked about surplus. So, what is a surplus? A general surplus in a market is when the quantity, supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And that kind of makes intrinsic sense, right? If there's an oversupply of something, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, you have a surplus. And we also learn how does a market clear a surplus by lowering prices. That's not what we're talking about here. A surplus is different than consumer surplus, which is defined as something completely different. Consumer surplus is the difference between what a buyer is willing to pay and what they actually pay. Okay, now it's easy to determine how much a buyer or a consumer is willing to pay because all you have to look is at the marginal benefit curve and see where it intersects that axis, and there's going to be a number there. So whatever that number is, where dead ends into that axis, is the maximum the buyer's willing to pay. It's also generally pretty easy to tell what the buyer actually paid by looking at, among other things, the price agreed to by the buyer and seller. So in this case, all right, the buyer was willing to pay 60, but only paid 40, and that difference is known as consumer surplus. So if you're thinking right now, well, that actually sounds like happiness, right? I mean, I was willing to pay up here, I only had to pay here. I'm happy. It just made my day. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. And you can also, though, identify a dollar amount, right? Because consumer surplus, if you take the quantity, then you can actually calculate the total consumer surplus by finding. So if the initial definition is the difference between what a buyer is willing to pay and pays, you could draw a line from those two, right? At this price, we know what the quantity is going to be, and then of course we're talking about consumers, so it's bound by the marginal benefit curve, and your total consumer surplus is simply going to be the area of that triangle. And as you learned in 8th grade, right, the area of a triangle is going to be 1/2 base times height. Well, the base here is 0 to 10, and the height is 60 minus 40. So in this calculation, consumer surplus would 60 minus 40 is 20, half 20 is 10, 10 times 10 is 100. Okay? And that's consumer surplus. Likewise, there's producer surplus. And producer surplus is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's the difference between the minimum that a seller is willing to accept, which again is pretty easy to figure out because all you have to do is look at where the marginal cost curve again intersects that axis, and whatever that number is, let's say it's 10, that's the minimum that the seller is willing to accept. So the difference between what the seller actually gets, let's say it's 40, and the minimum they're willing to accept, in this case 10, is producer surplus. And just like you did before, what you can do is, if that's your definition, right? So the difference between what the seller receives minus the minimum they're willing to, and then again you can this intersection is going to define some quantity. So you can take this out to that quantity, and then we're talking about producers or sellers, so it's going to be bound by the marginal cost curve. You're simply calculating the area of that triangle for total producer surplus. And just like before, 1/2 base times height. The base in this case is going to be 10, right? 0 to 10. And then the height this time is going to be 40 minus 10. So 40 minus 10 is what? 30. Half of 30 is 15. 15 times 10 is 150. The total producer surplus in this case would be 150. And it's okay that the producer surplus and the consumer surplus don't add up. But again, think of this as a little happiness and joy on the side of the producer. They were willing to take 10, but they got 40 instead. So, yay, happy days. This question occasionally comes up. Let's say a graph looks like this, and the marginal cost curve ends or crosses the axis at 0. Some folks look at that and go, well, that doesn't seem real, right? A seller, why would a seller accept 0? That doesn't seem real. But over the years, I've had several students give good examples of actually when this happens. If you own a restaurant and you can't keep the food at the end of the night, what do? Well, you may take the food to a homeless shelter or give the food away and accept 0 payment. Sometimes when you see folks selling, kittens or something like that in the parking lot of a Walmart, at the beginning of the morning when there's lots of kittens, the price may be whatever, but, towards the end of the day, the end of the afternoon when that single kitten's left, so long as it goes to a good home, the price could be 0. So that in fact is a reflection of sort of reality, okay? Now, let's combine those, right? Because marginal benefit, marginal cost, right? In the past, I've asked you to draw me a picture of a market in equilibrium, and you know that what's it take to have a market? Well, I'll get a buyer, seller, and they have to agree upon a price and quantity. Well, guess what? There's the price and the quantity that they agree upon. We know that this could also be known as supply. This could also be known as demand. That is not only a market in equilibrium, but that is a picture of an efficient market, right? Because remember, what's socially optimal? Where your marginal cost equals your marginal benefit. Marginal cost benefit, they cross at this point. And because the price and the quantity are coming off that point where this is equal, that is a picture of an efficient market in addition to a market in equilibrium. And in fact, if I put numbers up here, you could go ahead and calculate the consumer surplus and the producer surplus and add them together, or just calculate the area of that big triangle and calculate the total surplus of this efficient market. Okay. I'm going to stop the video and I'll be right back.